the weight of mud and straw.
The sun over the Nile Delta did not warm. It punished, it beat down upon the land of Goshen like an anvil of molten gold, baking the mud and cracking the earth. Here, under the towering, merciless shadows of Ra's monuments, the children of Israel bled into the sand. For 400 years, the descendants of Abraham had been bound in the chains of Egypt. The rhythm of their lives was dictated by the crack of the overseer's whip and the endless, grueling chant of labor. They built Pithom, they built Ramesses. Their sweat mixed with the straw and river clay to forge the bricks of an empire that despised them. Generations had been born in chains, lived in the suffocating heat of the brickyards, and died with the dust of Pharaoh's glory in their lungs. Yet, even as the edicts grew, crueler even, as the river Nile had once rung red with the blood of Hebrew newborn sons, their numbers grew. And in the silence of the desert nights, beneath a canopy of cold, indifferent stars, a collective groan rose from the tents of Goshen. It was a soundless scream of a broken people, echoing up past the stratosphere, reaching into the very courts of heaven. The God of their fathers was not asleep. He had heard their cry, and out in the desolate wastelands of Midian, he was already forging their deliverer.
The fire that does not consume.
Decades had passed since Moses fled the opulence of Egypt. Once a prince of the greatest empire on earth, he was now a simple shepherd, an old man with weathered skin and a staff of twisted wood. The golden chariots and the halls of marble were nothing but a distant, haunting memory, replaced by the silence of the flock and the rugged terrain of Mount Horeb. It happened on a day like any other. The dry wind howled through the crags of the mountain, known by the desert nomads as the Mountain of God. Moses was tracking a wandering way when his eyes caught a flicker of unnatural light. In a cleft of the rock, a single acacia bush was engulfed in roaring flames. The fire was brilliant, blindingly pure, dancing with hues of gold, blue, and searing white. But as Moses drew closer, shielding his eyes from the intense glare, he realized the impossible. The leaves were not turning to ash. The branches did not blacken. The bush burned, yet it was not consumed. As his sandals crunched against the gravel, a voice resonated. It did not just echo off the canyon walls. It reverberated within Moses' very bones, carrying the weight of galaxies and the warmth of a father. Moses, Moses. Trembling, the old shepherd dropped to his knees. Here I am. Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Moses unlaced his leather sandals, the hot, sacred earth burning against his bare soles. He buried his face in his cloak, terrified to look upon the divine. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. The decree was absolute. Moses, the exiled murderer with a stuttering tongue, was to return to the heart of the beast. He was to stand before Pharaoh, the living god of Egypt, demand the impossible. The great throne room of Memphis was a masterpiece of intimidation. Massive pillars shaped like lotus flowers stretched into the gloom of the high ceiling, painted in vibrant lapis lazuli and gold. At the far end, upon a raised dais flanked by statues of Horus, sat Pharaoh. He was a man who considered himself immortal, the master of the Nile, the arbiter of life and death. The heavy bronze doors groaned open, and two figures walked into the cavernous hall. They were out of place amidst the silk and gold-tooled men in coarse desert wool, holding nothing but wooden staffs. Moses and his brother Aaron stood before the might of the Egyptian empire. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. Aaron's voice boomed, empowered by an unseen force, echoing off the marble floors. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. Pharaoh leaned forward, a sneer curling his painted lips. His eyes, lined with heavy kohl, stared at the old men with a mixture of amusement and disdain. Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go. Pharaoh mocked. I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. Get back to your labor. To prove the power of his God, Aaron threw his wooden staff onto the marble floor. In a flash of terrifying transformation, the dead wood writhed, expanded, and hissed, turning into a massive, aggressive serpent that coiled upon the polished stone. The Egyptian court gasped, but Pharaoh simply waved his hand. His sorcerers stepped forward, muttering dark incantations, and threw down their own staffs. The dark magic of Egypt answered, and their staffs too became serpents. A murmur of arrogant triumph rippled through the courtiers. But the triumph was short-lived. With sudden, brutal speed, Aaron's serpent uncoiled, struck, and swallowed the Egyptian serpent's whole. Despite the display, Pharaoh's heart turned to stone. The battle for the freedom of Israel had officially begun. It would not be won with diplomacy. It would be won with terror.
The 10 blows of wrath.
What followed was a systematic dismantling of the Egyptian pantheon. The God of Israel did not just attack the economy of Egypt. He humiliated their gods, one by one. It began with the river. The lifeblood of the empire, the sacred Nile, was struck by Aaron's staff. Instantly, the cool, blue waters turned into thick, putrid blood. The fish died, floating belly up in the crimson sludge. The stench of rot blanketed the nation. For 7 days, Egypt drank blood. Then came the frogs, swarming out of the river in millions, covering the beds, the ovens, and the streets. When they died, the land reeked of decay. Then the dust of the earth turned into gnats, tormenting man and beast. Then swarms of massive flies darkened the sky, turning the beautiful cities into buzzing nightmares of filth. Yet the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, remained untouched. Still, Pharaoh's heart remained hard. The plagues grew deadlier. A sudden plague wiped out the Egyptian livestock. Horses, camels, and cattle collapsed in the fields. Then, festering boils erupted on the skin of every Egyptian, from the lowest servant to the high priests. The sky itself then turned against them. Moses stretched his staff toward the heavens, and the worst thunderstorm in history descended. Massive hailstones, laced with crackling fire, smashed into the earth, destroying crops, shattering trees, and striking down anyone caught in the open. What the hail did not destroy, the locusts finish. An east wind brought a black cloud of insects so dense it blocked out the sun. They devoured every green leaf, every remaining crop, leaving Egypt completely barren. Then came the ninth terror, a darkness that could be felt. For 3 days, a pitch-black, suffocating abyss covered the empire. No torch would light. No one could move. The Egyptians sat in absolute terror in the sensory deprivation of God's wrath. Yet, blinded by his own pride, Pharaoh roared at Moses, "Get out of my sight. Make sure you do not appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die." Moses' eyes completely steady, replied, "Just as you say. I will never see your face again." The 10th and final plague was coming, and it would break the empire's spine.
The night of the painted doors.
A chilling silence hung over the land of Goshen. Inside the Hebrew tents, families were gathered tightly together. By the strict command of Moses, every household had slaughtered a perfect, unblemished lamb. With a branch of hyssop, they had painted the lamb's blood on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of their homes. Inside, they ate the roasted meat in haste, fully dressed in traveling clothes, sandals on their feet, staffs in their hands. They ate unleavened bread, for there was no time to wait for yeast to rise. The air was thick with anticipation and dread. At midnight, a cold, unnatural wind swept through the streets of Egypt. The destroyer passed over the land. It did not matter if one was a peasant in a mud hut or Pharaoh in his palace. The angel of death moved silently. Wherever the blood of the lamb was painted, the shadow passed over. But where there was no blood, the firstborn son drew his final breath. A wail erupted. It started as a single, piercing scream in the distance, then multiplied into thousands, then millions. It was a cry of unimaginable grief that tore through the night sky. In every Egyptian home, someone was dead. Even the firstborn son of Pharaoh, the supposed heir to the gods, lay lifeless in the royal chambers, broken, defeated, and surrounded by death. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the dead of night. His voice, once dripping with arrogance, was now a hollow rasp. "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds, as you have said, and go. And also bless me." Before the dawn broke, the exodus began. 2 million people, men, women, children, carrying their kneaded dough and cloaks, leading massive herds of livestock, marched out of slavery. They carried the wealth of Egypt with them, given by terrified citizens begging them to leave. After 430 years, they were free.
Between the sand and the sea.
The journey was guided by a miracle. By day, a towering pillar of cloud led them, shielding them from the scorching desert sun. By night, it became a massive pillar of fire, casting a warm, golden glow over the massive encampment. Moses led the millions, not toward the shortest road to Canaan, but south, toward the jagged mountains and the shores of the Red Sea. They camped at Pi-Hahiroth, trapped between impassable mountain ranges on either side, the vast ocean in front of them, and the desert behind them. Meanwhile, in Memphis, grief had mutated back into rage. Pharaoh looked at his ruined country and his dead son. The realization struck him. He had just let his entire slave labor force walk away. "What have we done?" he hissed to his commanders. "You've let the Israelites go and lost their services." Over 600 of the best chariots in Egypt, alongside the entire cavalry and infantry, were mobilized. The earth shook under the thundering hooves of war horses as the Egyptian army chased down the runaway slaves, driven by an insatiable thirst for vengeance. As the sun began to set, the Israelites heard it, a low, terrifying rumble echoing from the desert. They looked to the horizon and saw a massive cloud of dust blotting out the setting sun. The gleaming bronze armor of the Egyptian war machine caught the light. Panic erupted. The Israelites were unarmed peasants trapped against a sea. Women screamed, children cried, and angry mobs surrounded Moses. "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" they shrieked. "It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses stood on a rocky outcrop, the wind whipping his cloak. He looked at the terrified millions, then at the approaching army of death. His voice rang out with absolute, unshakable authority. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Suddenly, the pillar of cloud that had been leading them moved. It swept backward, placing itself directly between the camp of Israel and the army of Egypt. To the Israelites, it cast a comforting light. To the Egyptians, it was an impenetrable wall of suffocating darkness. The armies were forced to a halt, unable to advance through the divine barrier. Then, the voice of God thundered in Moses' mind. "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." Moses stepped to the very edge of the churning ocean. He gripped his wooden staff and raised it high over the deep waters. A terrifyingly powerful east wind descended from the heavens. The sound was deafening, like the roar of 1,000 jet engines. The wind struck the ocean with apocalyptic force. The water violently churned, foaming and boiling, and then, defying all laws of nature, the sea began to rip apart. The ocean literally tore in half. Massive walls of water, hundreds of feet high, were pushed back on the left and the right. They stood trembling, defying gravity, looking like towering cliffs of solid aquamarine glass. Beneath them, the seabed was completely blown dry by the superheated wind. A wide, smooth canyon of dry land stretched out into the distance, right through the heart of the sea. "Move," Moses commanded. In the eerie, shimmering light of the pillar of fire, 2 million people stepped onto the ocean floor. To their left and right were towering walls of water, swirling with trapped sea life, held back by nothing but the invisible hand of the Almighty. They walked in stunned silence, their sandals crunching on dry shells and sand, crossing through the very abyss of the deep. By the time the last of the Israelites reached the far shore, morning was breaking. The pillar of cloud lifted its veil. Pharaoh's generals saw the miraculous dry path cutting through the ocean. Blinded by rage and bloodlust, Pharaoh ordered the charge. The entire Egyptian army's chariots, horses, and soldiers screamed their war cries and plunged onto the seabed, hurtling down the canyon of water in pursuit. But as they reached the middle of the sea, the divine protection over them vanished. The wheels of their heavy chariots suddenly jammed, sinking into mud that hadn't been there moments before. Axles snapped. Horses panicked, rearing and throwing their riders. Confusion and terror ripped through the ranks. "Flee!" an Egyptian commander screamed, his eyes wide with horror as he looked at the towering, trembling walls of water above them. "The Lord is fighting for Israel against Egypt." But it was too late. Safely on the opposite shore, Moses raised his staff once more over the sea. The roaring east wind stopped instantly. The invisible hands holding back the millions of tons of ocean water let go. With a sound like the world collapsing, the towering walls of the Red Sea crashed down upon themselves. The water violently imploded into the chasm. The Egyptian army didn't even have time to scream. Chariots, horses, and the proudest warriors of the ancient world were instantly obliterated, swallowed whole by the crushing, churning depths. The foam sprayed high into the dawn sky, and then the sea smoothed out, as calm and indifferent as if nothing had ever happened. On the shore, 2 million people stood in absolute, breathless silence. The greatest empire in the world had been erased in a matter of seconds. The bodies of Egyptian soldiers and the wreckage of chariots began to wash up on the shoreline, a silent testament to the ultimate victory. Miriam, Moses' sister, picked up a tambourine. A single beat echoed over the quiet morning air, then another. Soon, the rhythmic beating spread, and a song of ultimate triumph erupted from millions of lungs, shaking the desert mountains. They were slaves no more. They belonged to the wilderness now, and to the God who controlled the storms, the fire, and the sea.
The forgetting and the bread of heaven.
The euphoria of victory is a fragile thing. When the songs of Miriam faded and the tambourines fell silent, the brutal reality of the Sinai Peninsula set in. The sea was behind them, but the wilderness a vast, unforgiving ocean of blinding white sand, jagged limestone, and scorching wind lay ahead. 3 days. That was all it took for the memory of the greatest miracle in human history to evaporate under the punishing desert sun. For 3 days, 2 million people marched through the desert of Shur without finding a single drop of water. The heat was a physical weight. Children stopped crying, their throats too parched to make a sound. The livestock grew dangerously thin, their tongues hanging from their mouths. When they finally spotted the shimmering oasis of Marah, a desperate surge rippled through the camp. Men and women threw themselves at the water, cupping it in their cracked, bleeding hands. But as the water hit their lips, they gagged and spat it out. It was bitter, poisoned by the heavy minerals of the earth. "What are we to drink?" The people screamed at Moses, their eyes wild with dehydration and betrayal. Moses did not argue. He fell to his knees and cried out to the heavens. In response, God directed his eyes to a seemingly ordinary piece of dead wood lying in the sand. With trembling hands, Moses picked up the log and hurled it into the bitter pool. Instantly, the dark, toxic waters cleared. The minerals sank. The people drank deeply, the sweet, life-giving water restoring their bodies and their fragile faith. But the wilderness is a relentless teacher. Weeks later, as they pushed deeper into the desolate wasteland of sin, a new enemy emerged: starvation. The dough they had carried from Egypt was gone. The barren wasteland offered nothing but dust and scrub brush. Once again, the camp erupted in mutiny. "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt," they wailed. "There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." That evening, the horizon darkened, not with storm clouds, but with wings. A massive, deafening flock of quail, exhausted from their migration over the Red Sea, plummeted into the camp. The people feasted on roasted meat until they could eat no more. But the true miracle came with the dawn. When the Israelites emerged from their tents the next morning, the desert floor was not covered in sand. It was blanketed in a fine, shimmering substance as delicate as frost. It looked like coriander seed, glowing pale white in the morning sun. "What is it?" they asked one another in hushed, reverent tones. "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat," Moses declared. They called it manna. When baked, it tasted like wafers made with honey. For the next 40 years, this bread of angels would fall from the sky every single morning, a daily reminder of their absolute dependence on the unseen God. Yet, their thirst would test them one final time before the mountain. At Rephidim, the water ran out again. The mob grew violent, picking up jagged stones, ready to execute their deliverer. Guided by God, Moses took the same staff that had parted the sea and led the elders to a massive, imposing rock at Horeb. He raised the weathered wood and struck the solid granite. A sound like thunder cracked through the valley. The stones split open, and a violent torrent of pure, freezing water exploded outward, forming a rushing river in the middle of the desert. The God of the cosmos was not just a warrior. He was a provider.
The mountain of smoke and the golden idol.
In the 3rd month after fleeing Egypt, the Israelites arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai. It was a terrifying, monolithic peak of dark rock, towering over a vast desert plain. This was the exact place where Moses had seen the burning bush. But this time, God would not appear as a solitary flame. He would descend in the full, terrifying weight of his glory. Moses delivered the command, "Consecrate yourselves. Wash your garments. Do not touch the mountain. Whoever touches the edge of this mountain will be put to death." On the morning of the 3rd day, the sky turned black. A thick, suffocating cloud swallowed the peak of Sinai. Then the silence of the desert was shattered by a sound that made 2 million people drop to their knees in sheer terror. It was the sound of a ram's horn, a shofar, but it was not blown by human lungs. It was an apocalyptic blast that grew louder and louder until the very ground vibrated. Lightning, violent and relentless, fractured the darkened sky. Deafening peals of thunder rolled like artillery fire. Then, the Lord descended upon the mountain in fire. The smoke billowed up like the smoke from a massive, roaring furnace, and the entire mountain shook violently. Into this terrifying inferno of divine energy, Moses was called up. He disappeared into the thick, dark cloud, leaving the camp behind. He was gone for 40 days and 40 nights. Down in the valley, the fear faded, replaced by anxiety, and then by rebellion. The people had lived in Egypt for centuries. They were used to gods they could see, gods of gold and stone, gods they could touch and control. This invisible, terrifying God of the mountain and his vanishing prophet were too much for them. They cornered Aaron, Moses' brother. "Come," they demanded. "Make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Under the crushing pressure of the mob, Aaron caved. He ordered them to strip the gold earrings from their wives, sons, and daughters, the very gold they had taken from the Egyptians. Melting it down in a raging fire, Aaron used a tool to fashion it into the shape of a young bull, a golden calf. "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt," the people chanted. They built an altar. They offered sacrifices. And then, the camp devolved into a frenzied, chaotic festival of drunken revelry and pagan worship. The people stripped off their clothes, dancing wildly in the firelight around the lifeless golden beast, completely abandoning the God who had just shattered the greatest empire on earth to save them. High above, in the silent, holy darkness of the peak, God handed Moses 2 tablets of solid stone. They were etched with the 10 Commandments, the moral foundation of human history, written not with ink, but by the very finger of God. "Go down," God told Moses, his voice resonating with a terrifying, righteous wrath. "Your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them." Moses descended the jagged path. As he neared the camp, the horrific sound of pagan singing and drunken shouting reached his ears. He broke through the tree line and saw it: the glowing idol, the nakedness, the absolute betrayal. A holy, searing anger consumed the prophet. He lifted the 2 sacred tablets of stone, the floorless, divine covenant, and, with a massive cry of agony and rage, he hurled them to the ground.
The purge and the presence.
The silence that followed the shattering of the stone tablets was heavier than death. Moses marched into the center of the camp, his eyes burning with a terrifying, righteous fury. He did not speak. He grabbed the golden calf, the pathetic idol his people had traded their souls for, and hurled it into a roaring fire. As the gold melted, he ordered it ground into a fine, bitter powder, scattered it over the water, and forced the Israelites to drink the ashes of their own rebellion. "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me," Moses roared. The tribe of Levi rallied to his side, drawing their swords. That day, 3,000 instigators of the pagan revelry fell. The camp was violently purged of its corruption. In the aftermath, Moses, carrying the unbearable weight of his people's treason, climbed the dark slopes of Sinai once more. For 40 more days and nights, he lay prostrate before the Almighty, pleading for mercy. He offered his own soul in exchange for theirs. "But now, please forgive their sin, but if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." God heard the broken shepherd. Mercy triumphed over wrath. New stone tablets were carved, and when Moses finally descended the mountain, his face radiated a blinding, supernatural light, a reflection of the divine glory he had witnessed. He had to wear a veil just to speak to his people. From that forgiveness, a new era began. The Israelites pulled their remaining treasures, gold, silver, bronze, fine linen, and rare spices to construct the tabernacle. It was a magnificent, portable temple of heavy curtains and pure gold fixtures. Deep within its heart lay the Ark of the Covenant, shielded by the golden wings of cherubim. When it was finished, the sky darkened, and the massive pillar of cloud and fire descended from the heavens, filling the tabernacle. The creator of the universe had stepped out of the cosmos to dwell in a tent of animal skins among a nation of former slaves.
The edge of hope and the great betrayal.
Led by the fiery cloud, the massive encampment finally marched toward the culmination of their destiny, Kadesh Barnea, the very edge of the Promised Land. The barren desert gave way to the scent of damp earth, wild honey, and blooming fig trees. Moses sent 12 spies, one from each tribe, to scout the land of Canaan. For 40 days they explored the lush valleys and towering mountains. When they returned, they carried a single cluster of grapes so massive it had to be carried on a pole between 2 men. "It does indeed flow with milk and honey," they reported. But then, 10 of the spies cast a dark, suffocating shadow over the camp. "But the people who live there are powerful. The cities are fortified and very large. We saw the Nephilim, their giants. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Fear, the old master of Egypt, gripped the Israelites' throats. Only 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, stood their ground, tearing their clothes in desperation. "Do not be afraid of the people of the land," Caleb shouted. "Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us." But the mob was deaf to faith. They picked up heavy stones, ready to crush Joshua and Caleb, screaming for a new leader to take them back to the chains of Egypt. Suddenly, the glory of the Lord flashed at the tabernacle. The divine patience had finally run out. The judgment was swift and absolute. God spoke, his voice echoing with profound sorrow and finality. Not one of those who saw my glory in the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you will suffer for your sins, and know what it is like to have me against you. They had reached the door of paradise, but because they refused to turn the handle, the door was locked. They were condemned to wander the unforgiving desert until an entire generation of doubt turned to dust.
The weight of leadership and the fatal strike.
The decades blurred into a brutal cycle of survival. The older generation slowly died off, buried under nameless dunes of sand, while a new generation grew up hardened by the desert wind, knowing nothing but the daily miracle of manna and the towering pillar of fire. Yet, the wilderness takes its toll on even the greatest of men. At Meribah, the water failed once again. The people, mirroring the sins of their fathers, turned on Moses with vicious complaints. Moses was exhausted. He was over 100 years old, carrying the emotional weight of millions of rebellious souls. God instructed him, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water." But as Moses stood before the massive stone, looking at the angry, ungrateful faces of the crowd, something inside him snapped. The meekest man on earth finally lost his temper. "Listen, you rebels," Moses shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "Must we bring you water out of this rock?" Instead of speaking to the rock as commanded, Moses raised his heavy wooden staff and struck the stone violently. Once, twice, the water exploded outward in a massive torrent. The people drank, but a heavy silence fell upon Moses' soul. He had not struck the rock. He had struck God's holiness. He had claimed the miracle for himself in a moment of arrogant fury. The divine whisper that followed was heartbreakingly quiet. "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." The deliverer would not see the deliverance complete.
The summit of Nebo and the promised rest.
The 40 years came to an end. The desert had done its work. The slave mentality was dead. A nation of hardened, faithful warriors stood ready at the plains of Moab. Moses was 120 years old. His physical strength was undiminished, his eyes still sharp, but his time on earth was over. In a solemn, emotional ceremony, Moses laid his hands upon Joshua, a warrior of unwavering faith, transferring the mantle of leadership. Then, leaving the weeping camp behind, the old prophet walked alone up the steep, rocky slopes of Mount Nebo. He reached the summit as the sun began to set, painting the sky in strokes of bruised purple and burning gold. From the peak of Pisgah, God granted him a miraculous, sweeping vision. Moses looked across the Jordan River. He saw the lush green palm trees of Jericho. He saw the rolling hills of Gilead, the sparkling waters of the Sea of Galilee, and the vast, fertile plains stretching all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was the fulfillment of a promise made centuries ago to Abraham beneath a starry sky. "This is the land," the Lord whispered to his faithful servant. "I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." Moses did not weep. He did not argue. He simply closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of the promised land, carried on the western wind. There, alone on the silent mountain, surrounded by the presence of the God he had spoken to, face to face Moses breathed his last, and God himself buried him in a valley, in a grave no man would ever find. Epilogue. The next morning, the sun rose over a new Israel. Joshua stood at the banks of the roaring Jordan River. Behind him, the priests hoisted the golden ark of the covenant onto their shoulders. They did not hesitate. As the priests took their first step into the raging water, the river instantly stopped flowing, piling up in a heap miles away. Another sea of water had parted. Another dry path was laid bare. The trumpets sounded, The millions marched forward, crossing the riverbed, their boots stepping onto the soft, fertile soil of Canaan. The wilderness was over. The age of slaves had passed. The age of conquerors had begun.